Over the past 5 months, I've been able to use the Sony FX6 on a variety of different projects, and there's a lot of things that I like about the camera. In this video, I'm going to talk about what I like and show some examples. Here's the story. The first thing that I like about this camera is it shoots 4K up to 120 frames per second, so it does really good slow motion. Not only does it do great slow motion, but it also has 4K 10-bit at 120 frames as well. Most of the time, because I shoot in a PAL territory, I shoot at 25 frames per second, and typically I shoot 100 frames instead of the 120. And in those 100 frames, it has amazing autofocus. A lot of other cameras currently that are out right now, if they do shoot 4K 120 frames per second, they don't have autofocus, whereas the Sony FX6 does. And not only does it have autofocus, but it is reliable if you use the autofocus settings correctly. And that's a big thing to learn about this camera. If you've got your autofocus settings set to too slow with your sensitivity or speed, then you're not going to get the results that you want if you're shooting something that's fast action, like a person running as fast as they can towards the camera with sunglasses and a hat on. But in this example, you can see that it does work. And not only does it work, it does an excellent job. This camera also has waveform, and this is something that I just assumed would be in other cameras like the A7S III, which I'm shooting with right now. But when I first got that camera, I was actually quite shocked to find out that waveform doesn't exist on it. When I was shooting with the Panasonic S1, it had waveform included, and it was just something that I took for granted. And when I got the A7S III and found that it didn't have waveform, I was a little bit disappointed. Fortunately, the Sony FX6 has waveform built in, and it is a really helpful exposure tool when you're shooting in the studio like this, or if you're out and about shooting outside. The FX6 also has shutter angle, which really makes it easy for you to switch between the different frame rates and have that motion blur that you want to be able to capture in your images. Most of the time, I like to use a 180-degree shutter angle because it gives me natural motion blur. And one of the benefits of using shutter angle instead of shutter speed, which is like 1/50 or 1/60, depending on what kind of frame rate you're shooting with, is that when you go from shooting your normal 25 frames per second, like I do with shooting in a PAL territory, to going to shooting 100 frames per second, the shutter angle automatically changes that motion blur for you, and you don't have to recalculate, okay, I want to have double the shutter speed of the frames that I'm shooting, because that's typically the rule that I use to be able to get the motion blur the way that I want. It's called the 180-degree shutter rule. So that's really handy to not have to worry about doing that extra step when you're changing between frame rates. So that's a good feature to have on the Sony FX6. The camera also has 9 assignable buttons, which is really handy to have. You've got 3 on the camera body here. You've then got 1 on the LCD monitor here. You've got 2 on the top handle here, and you've got 3 on the side handle here. And here's a list of all the assignable buttons that I've currently got on my Sony FX6. And the great thing is they're all customizable. So if something's working for me one day and then not really working for me the next, I can always change it. And there are lots of options to choose from. The Sony FX6 also has a lot of dynamic range, especially when you're shooting in S-Log3. Now the advertised dynamic range is 15 plus stops, but when you get into real world tests and actual practical use of dynamic range, it might be a little bit less, but when you see the marketing numbers of 15 stops of dynamic range, you know you're going to be getting quite a lot of dynamic range in the camera. And that is what I've found so far when shooting with the FX6. Camera, as I mentioned before, has a top handle, which I really like, which means you're able to hold it like so. Some people aren't really a big fan of the top handle. I don't mind it. I find it does the job and it allows me to hold the camera and get the shots that I need. Some people might want to take the handle off and then replace it with a third-party handle, something else that they think feels better in their hands, or is just something more customizable to the way that they want to shoot. But for me, I like it, and it also has the benefit of having the 2 XLR inputs, which I don't normally use. Actually, I've only used it once so far. Normally I'm recording audio externally, so I have a Mix Pre 3 Mark II to record my audio. It also has 32-bit float, which is kind of like the raw version of audio, and I love it. And it's really ideal for people like myself that might be on smaller crews and don't necessarily have multiple people to run video, run audio, run lighting. It just makes things a lot more simpler, and it gives you that peace of mind knowing that even if the audio does clip, in post, you can bring it back and it sounds just the way it should have sounded if you were recording it at the proper levels. The top handle also has a record button, a zoom rocker as well, which you can map to use clear image zoom as well. Or if you've got a lens that is capable of zooming, you can also use it to zoom with that as well. And it's got a joystick and a hot shoe as well. So you can put, if you've got the Sony wireless receiver, you can put that in there, and then that can pipe audio into your camera as well, and you don't need to use cables, which is something that I haven't taken advantage of yet, but is definitely a feature that I might consider down the road. But as I just mentioned, I do most of the time use an external audio recorder, so right now it's not a burning item I need to purchase. Now, one of the downsides with the handle is if you take the handle off, you do lose those XLR inputs. Once again, not a big deal for me, but something that you should be aware of. The camera also has a side handle. So if you want to change the positioning of the handle, it's very easy. You just use this little button here where my thumb is, and then you can change it like so. Really handy. It's a very similar setup to what I had on my Panasonic EVA 1, but I do find this one to be a little bit more stable. I found the EVA 1 side handle was a little bit creaky and a little bit jittery. Sometimes there was a little bit of play in it, but this one is a lot more solid, and I do prefer it over the Panasonic EVA 1. Side handle also has a record button, a joystick as well for navigating through menus, a zoom rocker, and 3 assignable buttons, as I mentioned before. And the third assignable button is kind of hidden here, where my finger is, just behind there. If you push that, that will activate your third assignable button. And that is really useful to know as well. Initially, when I was looking for that last assignable button, I didn't know where it was. And I think I had to do a Google search, and then I found the answer. Also with this camera, you have an LCD screen here, which you can turn around, and you can also mount it on multiple places around the camera. So it's not just fixed to one point. So with most mirrorless cameras, when you're pulling out your screen, you can't move the screen around your camera and reposition it in a place that might be more ideal for the way that you like to shoot. Whereas with the FX6, you can put it on, you can take it off, and you can mount it in multiple locations to whatever position that you might find beneficial for your shooting style. The camera also has 2 SD card slots and CF Express Type A slots. And this is really handy because you can then use these 2 card slots to either extend your runtime or make an extra copy of the footage that you're recording. So if you're recording on slot A and the memory card fills up, it will then seamlessly go across to slot B, even if you're recording that one clip as well, and it will allow you to keep recording whatever it is that you're filming. Or if you're someone that likes redundancy, then you can record all your clips onto a slot A, and then everything on slot B will be a mirror of that as well. So you're making 2 copies of the same clips that you're recording. And this can be helpful just in case one of your cards fail or gets corrupted or lost or damaged or whatever. So if you're someone like a wedding videographer or someone that does a lot of doco work where there's no chance of doing a second take and you need to make sure that you've got that footage, then that could be a really handy feature for you as well. The autofocus on this is another thing that I like, and it's amazing. You'll hear a lot of people talking about it, but as I mentioned earlier in the video, you really do need to understand the focus settings. I'm not going to go too in depth into it here, but if you get this camera and you hear that it's got great autofocus and you're not really happy with its performance, a lot of the time it could be user error. If you dial in the settings like the sensitivity and the speed to something that's appropriate for what you're filming, you will most likely find that this autofocus is really reliable and something that you can count on in a lot of situations. Also, the electronic variable ND is something you've probably heard about, and it is also amazing. And this is something that really sets this camera apart from most of the other cameras that are out there on the market today, including the camera that I'm using right now, the Sony a7S III. If the Sony a7S III had a built-in variable ND, it could very well be one of those cameras that everyone would be hailing as being almost perfect. There are a few limitations with the a7S III that I've already mentioned. Doesn't have waveform, doesn't have shutter angle, which for me stops it from being that perfect camera. For you, you might not care about that. But if it had those features plus the electronic variable ND that the Sony FX6 has, then this camera could very well be the perfect camera for the types of videos that I do. Now, I do believe that the reason that the a7S III doesn't have a built-in variable ND is because it has IBIS, in-body image stabilization. And if you have the in-body image stabilization plus a variable ND, it doesn't work properly. So unfortunately, until they figure that out, we're going to have to choose between one or the other, electronic variable ND or IBIS. And in the Sony FX6, unfortunately, there is no IBIS. And that is a little bit of a letdown for me, but I do get around that by using the Sony 24-105 f4 lens, and that has OSS, or optical steady shot. So that helps smooth out the images, smooth out the motion that I'm recording. And if it's really that bad, then I can also use a Cine Saddle or some other support system to make sure that I get those steady shots. The camera also has two base settings as well for ISO, and that's a low and a high setting. And when you're shooting in S-Log3, that is at 800 ISO. And when you're shooting in the high setting, it's 12,800 ISO. And this is really helpful if you're a documentary filmmaker and you don't have lights on hand to be able to light specific scenes, or you shoot a lot of low light scenes as well. This is extremely handy to get the shot, and also get the shot that is also usable. So in the past, you might crank your ISO up to 25,000 or whatever, just to get the shot. But then when you get it back, you find that's really grainy and mushy and doesn't look very good. Whereas with the Sony FX6, when you use the high ISO, it does a really good job of giving you nice clean images. And then after that, if you find that there is still a little bit too much noise, then you can just take it into your editing program and use some noise reduction there as well. Speaking of noise reduction, this camera also does have that built in. You can choose to have it off, you can choose to have it on, and you can also choose 3 different settings, so low, medium, and high. And I find that medium is acceptable for what I want to use it for. And this is really only used if you've got projects that are fast turnaround. So if you've got the time to go into your editing program and use a plugin like Neat Video, then go ahead and do that. But if you've got really long interviews and you've got a really quick turnaround time and you don't have the time to be able to have your computer processing all that Neat Video filtering, then it might be a usable option for you to use. Whereas on cameras like the A7S III, noise reduction is just automatically in there and it's baked in and you can't turn it off. So that's one of the different features that you can find in the Sony FX6 as opposed to the A7S III. I also like that you can connect your phone to the Sony FX6 by using NFC. That's really handy. And the camera also has a Super 35 mode, but only in HD. Because it's a 4K sensor, you can't use Super 35 crop mode on this camera in 4K because there isn't enough pixels for the camera to be able to zoom in on and be able to do that feature. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you wanted to shoot 4K in Super 35, that's where you'd purchase a camera like the Sony FX9, which is quite more expensive than the FX6. As mentioned before, this camera also has clear image zoom, and that's kind of like a digital zoom that Sony has that you can do inside the camera. This is a feature that I don't really use or haven't really used. The main reason is because I really like the autofocus on this camera, but when you use clear image zoom, you can't use the autofocus. So that is something to keep in mind. The camera also has Telly Lights on the front, back, and record button, and this is really handy to let me know that I'm recording or to let talent know that I'm recording. If I don't want people to know that I'm recording and turn off the red Telly Lights as well, I can do that too. The camera also has SDI Out, which I find really handy as well. This is a more robust connector than just your normal HDMI. The last thing that I want is for my HDMI cable to come undone while I'm recording. And if I'm using an external recorder, if the HDMI cable came out for whatever reason, that could be quite catastrophic to my shoot, depending on whether I'm recording internally to the camera as well, or it's just another thing that can go wrong. So what I like about the SDI is it's a locking connector, it locks in, whereas with HDMI, it just plugs in and can be a little bit loose sometimes and possibly fall out. I haven't had an HDMI cable fall out yet, but I don't really want to run that chance. I also really like the form factor of this camera. I find it's a really good size for me to be able to get handheld shots, but it's also a good size just to put on a tripod. It's not too heavy, it's not too big, and I really do like how it fits in my hand and I'm able to operate the camera. I do prefer this over having a mirrorless camera. It just feels and operates more smoothly for my shooting style. The camera also allows me to use big batteries like this Core SWX 98 watt-hour battery. And I find that using one of these batteries along with using the D-Tap out as well, connected to my Shinobi, allows me to record for around 3 hours or so. So about half a day video shoot. And I have 2 of these batteries, so having 2 of these batteries plus the battery that came with the FX6 allows me peace of mind knowing that if I had a full day shoot and I was recording a lot of footage that day and need the camera to be on for the majority of the shoot day, that all these batteries will have me covered. And I don't need to be changing batteries every 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, or whatever that some of the other mirrorless cameras and even some of the other cameras like the Blackmagic cameras as well, they're known to have very short battery lives. So having just one battery that I can put in and know that it will run my camera and monitor for several hours is peace of mind that I really enjoy having. This battery also has a USB out as well, so you can power things through USB if you need to as well. So a really handy battery, and so far it has served me well. I have found that the estimated run times sometimes can be a little bit misleading. I was on a shoot the other day and it said I had about 30 minutes left on the LCD screen on my FX6, but then my FX6 got to a point where it would not record anymore because it was such low battery. So that is something to keep in mind. So in my experience, if it gets down to about half an hour, you probably need to start thinking about swapping over. And finally, the last thing that I like about this camera is the E-mount. So I've gone from shooting with cameras that used EF lenses, Micro Four Thirds lenses, and also L-mount lenses. And using the Sony FX6, I really like the E-mount lenses because it's got an ecosystem of lenses that is quite mature. There are lots of options for you to choose on the E-mount system. They've got all your wides, they've got a lot of telephotos and a lot of primes. And I find that if I'm wanting a specific type of lens, the E-mount has it. And it also simplifies my workflow between the 2 cameras that I'm currently using, the A7S III and the FX6. I know that if I get an E-mount lens that is FE, so a full frame lens, that it will work seamlessly across both my cameras, which is great. And also a lot of these lenses have a customizable button as well. So if you want an extra button on your camera, there's your 10th one. And they're the things that I like about the Sony FX6 after using it for nearly 5 months. I'm sure there'll be new things that I come across in the coming months as well that I also like and I didn't include in this video. Maybe I'll add that in a later video, but let me know what you think. Are there features on this camera that you really like? Are there things that you really don't like? Have you used the Sony FX6 or are you interested in using it? Let me know in the comments. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel for more videos on content creation and the Sony FX6 in the future.